Let's come to the presentation today. This is the 38th presentation in a year of 52. And these 52 presentations as an annual ambit circuit divide themselves into quarters of 13. 13 and 13 is 26, a half a year, and 2 halves of a year, 52. That particular shape is the old semester shape in university teaching. And it goes back not only for courses as a semester course, but it goes back to the quarters then of seminars. And its origins go all the way back, really, to presentations that began in the Renaissance, when there was a recalibration of what universities were from the medieval universities. The great University of Paris or Oxford from medieval times did not have that particular structure. It allowed for an annual cycle to have quarters. And the change that came because of the 1960s into the 1970s of going off the semester system into the quarter system was a kind of a attempt to make education available on a very rational, systematic basis. But the quarter system on the semester basis is superior because it follows the seasons of an annual cycle and gives you qualities that are mythically and ritually and thus symbolically natural and can have their translation even if you go into a program where a degree will be 4 years, it'll be 4 times 4. It'll have that quality of 16 parts to a whole. And we've talked several times of how the classical Buddha, who was one of the most refined meditators of the species, found that a moment of thought, in Sanskrit, a moment of thought is called a citta, C-H-I-T-T-A, citta, because he found that there was a citta, a moment of thought, that winks out and winks back in without leaving a trace of anything left over or anything that had not vanished or anything that had not reappeared. And he called that moment a bodhicitta, a moment of enlightenment. Not the disappearing of the moment of thought into emptiness, into zero-ness, as it were, but the spontaneous re-emergence of that moment intact. And that once that moment re-emerged, it instantly was able to engage instantaneity, meaning time. And that bodhicitta had 16 parts, but only 8 of them, half of them, were able to be distinguished and thus become discursive, in the sense that one could actually name them. The subatomic structure of time. The other 8 could not be separated. They always occurred, and the word that I've used for almost half a century is they occur as a trill. So when I designed, over many decades, a 2-year program having 4 phases in each year, so together there would be 8 phases, I made sure that architecturally, to be truthful to the real, not of an education system, but of learning as it will actually occur, to space, to articulate the 8 phases with 8 intervals of presentation that do not count into the phases, so that the 13th phase, presentation, will always be an interval that is of a different quality of time from the others, meaning that the 4 phases of each year, the 8 phases of the paired year program, do not follow into a linear series. What they do is that they expand and collapse at the same time into matrices. And that these 8 matrices are able to be related together harmonically. The ancient wisdom of this came when music became recognizable in the architecture of its structure, that there are 8 notes that form an octave. And those 8 notes that form an octave have a very specific audio structure. The first 7 notes of the octave are ascending, but the 8th note is ascending in such a way that it is a very close and yet distinguishable variant of the beginning, of the first. So one counts the octave as do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. It is one move higher, one increment higher, but still a part of that octave. So that octave is able to have a continuity with a second octave that is brought with it. And so one can have not a series of linearity to octaves, but to have a harmonic that interpenetrates the matrices of the octaves. And for instance, a piano will have 11 octaves on one instrument because it is harmonically tuned. And the only way to keep it in tune is to be able to have a tuning bar for each of the octaves. And so when you tune the piano to be the harmonic instrument that it is for music, you take the 8 set of tuning bars and you restore it back to its harmonic expressivity. That is the difference between a learning and an education. An education is always a systematic reduction according to some plan of limitations. And a learning is a continuity that is expandable even into 0 fields and infinite fields. This is why this particular year, 2014, the year-long series is called the Parayana. It's not just a name. Yana in Sanskrit is way. Para is beyond, but beyond in a sense that it is a little bit above, like something paranormal or paradise. It has a quality that it has not a completeness, but it has a perfectibility. in that it is able to restore itself to a continuity which can be infinite, or a continuity which can be zero comfortably, a fertile emptiness that is able to spontaneously emerge in a seed that can be whole almost instantly if one is able to have a sense of truthfulness beyond the limitations of a system or a plan, so that one is able to operate with real freedom in perfection. And that real perfection, that zero field meeting infinite field, is in ancient wisdom called eternity. So that the Parayana is the way beyond limitations, plans, educations, organizations of this, that, and the other that are consistent with the way in which even phenomenality occurs. Even existence blossoms out of that phenomenality. That phenomenality has a quantification that is capable of disappearing completely faster than instantaneous and reappearing faster than instantaneous. And so this do-si-do between 0 and 1, this actuality, when it goes to systematizing it, it is of an infinite filigree. You can keep dicing it up and dicing it up. But the key index to this is how one brings the first dimension into play, and that first dimension is time. We say that a very short time is a fraction of a second. And at Caltech, here in the metropolitan LA region, it got into scientific chemistry about 25, 30 years ago, to the filigree that a genius was able to write a 2-volume textbook on femtochemistry. Because the femtosecond is the threshold at which molecular action occurs. That genius, by the way, was an Arab from Alexandria, Egypt, 20th century Alexandria, Egypt, Ahmad Zewail. He wrote an autobiography also to go. But the 2-volume femtochemistry set, it's a collector's item now and very, very expensive, very hard to find. But femtochemistry was refined in the 21st century, not too long ago, to attophysics. Because the attosection is the way in which atomic motion occurs in that scalar of time. And the attosecond is to the femtosecond like the femtosecond is to the ordinary watch second. And the refinement can go subatomic to designations of time that literally are beyond comprehension, unless one goes into a Parayana, in which case one is able to deal with all of the zeros as fertile and all of the infinities as creative. That way, a third field occurs, the field of the real. And it is in that freedom of that triple field, scalar, that species are able finally to leave their sandbox and go to the beach. In our case, it's leaving the world, Earth, and going to the beach that is the starry expanse of interstellar space. of galactic swirls, of clusters of galactic swirls that make galactic clusters that cluster together into superclusters. And last week we took a look at the just now available way in which the filigree of science and analytics going into the Parayana very, very, very deep, high, wide, and free was able to present the first image of our next level of true home. That is a 500 million light years across and is shaped like a high altitude cloud swirl. Some people used to say it looks like some kind of divinity in the sky. And they used, because they were using the pair of Keck telescopes. William Keck was a Caltech grad a long time ago and put up his many millions and tens of millions to build a pair of 10-meter telescopes in Mauna Kea. And it is this quality of the two eyes of 10 meters able to go through a refinement called adaptive optics, so that one was able, through new qualities of analytic, to be able to survey not just 1 million stars at a time, like Kepler in its satellite prowess, but to absorb the light of hundreds of millions of galactic structures at the same time and do some astrophysics that's almost like acrobatic pirouettes to be able to see that not only is there this 500 million light years super duper cluster of galaxies where it has 3 like protuberances that swirl out, and at the center one, at the very point of it, is where our Milky Way galaxy has its dynamic complex movement in reality. When Nature published 2 weeks ago the cover with Laniakea, the Hawaiian word, because they were on Mauna Kea in Hawaii, the Hawaiian word Laniakea means the highest heaven, the holy, real heaven. It's a real home. So it is going to kindergarten to talk about maturing this world to go into a planetary home initially. And that what seems incredibly audacious is actually picking up the first letter block in kindergarten and learning that, A. In the Parayana, there was a time where the Prajna Paramita Sutra, the very first time that there became a perfection of wisdom writing, was by a woman, a feminine. She was first named Lady Prajna Paramita. And later on, she became a bodhisattva, someone who is able to live completely in a bodhicitta that extends into eternity, and to be able to receive all of the adventures of the masculine qualities of our species into a feminine wisdom of appreciation, and also learning a teaching which is not a teaching by system, but a way of sharing, so that teaching becomes sharing. And it's not sharing information, it's sharing a participation of freedom. in life, which is the existence out of phenomenality, which can come and go instantly and does all the time between zero and emergence. Radiation and absorption. It happens all the time in the subatomic level. So that the actuality of all of this and everything is that it is a vibrational dance that is choreographed in ways of learning that phases that come out of seasons are a transform that is able to distill in a second transform to dimensions. And that this is the ABCs of beginning to be an interstellar frontier species, which is like kindergarten to the maturity that is possible. But walking a child to their kindergarten first day is an experience a parent never forgets. It's like having seen them walk for the first time. They're walking free into a new life in those moments. I remember my daughter's first walking. I was talking to my then wife's father-in-law, an old army surgeon, colonel from the Second World War and Korean War and so forth, and we were talking at his front door of his house in Westchester, and in between us walked this little tiny girl, Sarah Nokomis Weir, and she walked past us and walked out to the sidewalk and turned around smiling. And we looked at each other. Can you imagine that? It is a quality where learning becomes a joy because it delivers us not just another step, but another scalar into appreciation. That the arts and sciences emerge as dimensions of consciousness out of vision and history. And this is why the arts and sciences make a new kind of university in the Renaissance. Because they have stepped out of the constricting doctrine planned systems of scholasticism. They still understand, but they understand historically how that came to be, and they still are able to vision new qualities of history that don't just erase it, but that put it into perspective where it's only an unfortunate line of development that belongs to something that's more like a meteor than to something that is orbital in a complex celestial mechanics ballet called a planetary system, called a star system, and that there is such a thing now. Now, at this threshold of there being an interstellar frontier, that civilization must be minimally a stellar civilization. The whole star system has a scalar to it. And for us to have trepidation of thinking that just going into low Earth orbit is some kind of real technological achievement, half a century after we already became extraplanetary by going to the moon, shows us that somebody has scholastically closed the doors and taken away the signs that read exit or entrance, and made it chic to say that there are no thresholds. There's only the next step based on now. So get now with the next. And you'll be okay. You'll be a part of the party. It's high time to learn. So the Parayana now, with the 38th presentation, moves into a more grand scalar coming real soon. The 39th next presentation will be 3/4 of the way through, and the last quarter is a harvest quarter. It's like the energy of life, everyone now understands as a double helix of DNA. That's the continuity of life. It's well known, but hardly realized yet, that all double helixes on our planet are right-handed, and that there is a chirality to helical structures that means that there are left-handed, as many left-handed chiralities as there are right. And that in a very larger scalar, there are life forms that would seem to us to be mirrors of ourselves, but are chirally complementary to us in ways which go back to the very basis of the structure of life itself, but share a source in phenomenality. And there are maturations in learning where one doesn't have a referent back to phenomenality even, but one is able to go to higher dimensions, to a hyperspace 10-dimensional field where all interstellar civilizations have their concourse of communication. They don't use radio. They don't use this, that, and the other. But there's a high dharma where there's an 11th dimension, like in string theory, which is beyond, it is para-hyperspace, where it isn't about space at all. It isn't just about language, about sound. Because there's a primordiality to sound like there is to space-time. And the wisdom that goes like the old phrase in the Renaissance was like a golden thread, like a golden chain, like Homer's golden chain, that one can understand there's a fertility in eternity that is able to come into play, into life, into phenomenality through love. And it is this quality then that becomes quite interesting. And at the level where one moves from a world, even a global understanding that the world is a global, is still an empire presupposition. A one world, we own it all, we control it all, which is currently a fever, as one can appreciate. That fever can be broken by doctors of civilization that know to treat it as a fever and don't kill the patient because they're ill, but treat them with learning so that they can get out of the seasonal quality of revolution and counter-revolution, out of this empire against that empire, of these kinds of things, and be able to find a healing by understanding that there's a geometricity to civilization we can call time forms. And the time forms are not important as a structure of discursive limitation, but as an appreciation of a higher trigonometric functioning that is the base of the true development of a calculus. That in between that zero field and that oneness of a universe, which is phenomenal, there are an infinite array, scalar, of in-betweens. And one can utilize this in terms of a mathematic by going either way, like chirality. You can go from 0 to 1 or from 1 to 0 with infinite detail to as much exactness as you care to specify it. The infinitesimal calculus of Newton and Leibniz, independently at the same time, completely different sources. Leibniz, through acquaintance with a translation, a Jesuit translation of the I Ching into Latin, sent to the bustling city of Amsterdam because the Dutch were all over Indonesia and Southeast Asia, and the Jesuits brought back a translation of the I Ching into Latin, and it ended up in the hands of the only person in Amsterdam who cared about it, was Spinoza, an exile from his Jewish community, and because he was Jewish, he was exiled really ostensibly from the rest of the community, and as a lone wisdom wolf, he was overjoyed to find a young man that he could talk to, and that was a 20-year-old Leibniz. And he showed him the translation in Latin and what it meant. And Leibniz, out of that, developed his version of the calculus. At the same time that Newton was developing the calculus based on the Hermetic alchemical tradition. We're going to come back from the break, but what's important here for us at this stage of the Parayana is to understand that the largest scale of illnesses and fevers in civilization are due to regressions of time-form complements, elements. And when we come back, we'll take a Doctor of Civilization's look at restoring health.